Max is not having a brilliant afternoon here. Red Bull is struggling.
It's really bad at the moment, and before Baku we have a lot of work to do to basically change the whole car.
Well, that's what Max Verstappen had to say after the Italian Grand Prix. And as a result of those comments, we've decided to take a slightly deeper look at Red Bull in this week's Tech Talk. And we're going to ask some pretty big questions. What's gone wrong with the RB20? Do the engineers have the answers? And what are they actually going to do to make the car work? Well, let's get straight to it and ask the first of those big questions. Is anything wrong with Red Bull at all? After all, Max Verstappen was the quickest driver in free practice 1 in Azerbaijan. Well, the answer to the question is yes, something has distinctly been wrong at Red Bull. Take a look at this data. This is the lap time improvement in qualifying at the Bahrain Grand Prix 2023 compared to 2024. And you can see with this data that a couple of teams, Mercedes and Aston Martin, made pretty big gains. 0.7 of a second, nearly a full second for Mercedes, but both of those teams had some pretty big steps forward in terms of their car design, their car concept year on year. Perhaps a slightly more accurate measure of what you expect to see in terms of car development, pace improvement year on year, is Ferrari, nearly 0.6 of a second, compared to Red Bull, slightly slower with 0.5 of a second. That's not really anything. So Red Bull's development pace year on year is about right in Bahrain. But things didn't stay that way as the season progressed. You may remember recently at the Hungarian Grand Prix, Red Bull introduced this major upgrade package, which looked to me like the back of the car had melted, or they'd taken some inspiration from an old Renault from the early 2000s. And they completely revised the cooling system on the car. Massive package, really brave development for Red Bull. Problem is, it didn't really work, did it? And when you start looking at the lap times compared from 2023 to 2024 at the Dutch Grand Prix, where Red Bull also used the same aero package. The reason we can't use Hungarian data is that the weather was a bit iffy. It was also a bit iffy at Zandvoort, but we did get some quick data on the fastest laps of Q3 to compare drivers and teams to one another. You can see that Ferrari improved by almost 2 seconds year on year. That's massive. That's not just down to the weather conditions, even though it was very windy around Zandvoort. McLaren 1.4 seconds, Mercedes a second, Aston Martin nearly a second as well. But look at Red Bull, their improvement down here at 0.5. So their relative performance improvement wasn't really all that good. Could they have reached the limit of what you can get out of these cars? Well, the answer to that is probably no. McLaren uses a pretty similar car concept to Red Bull, and at that circuit, they were quicker. Well, let's go to a very different sort of race circuit, a low downforce, low drag circuit. Best option to go to, Monza. And that's where Red Bull used this bodywork package, which we've seen early for most of the season. That's their low downforce, low drag package. They muck around with some of these cooling outlets a little bit as the season goes on, and they go back to their conventional cooling layout with the shoulder coolers that we saw at the start of the season. Well, let's look at Monza and how the improvement year on year worked there. Again, qualifying 3 data, fastest lap for the fastest driver in each of these teams, and have a look. Lando Norris, 1.6 second lap time improvement, Russell 1.2, Leclerc just under a second. The interesting subject here is Alex Albon. The Williams team, with their massive change of concept, still nearly 0.5 second improvement year on year. Red Bull, just under 0.3 of a second improvement. So again, Red Bull's development doesn't seem to be working. And at the end of the Italian Grand Prix, Red Bull were pretty open. They do have problems with their development process. But to answer the question, has something really gone wrong? Well, we heard from the team, we heard from the drivers that the balance was slightly off on the car. And to explain that a little bit more, Paul Monaghan joins us to explain exactly what's gone wrong at Red Bull.
Well, balance is your, shall we say, optimisation between understeer and oversteer. So if your balance window is enlarging, you've got more understeer and more oversteer. When the balance window narrows, you have less of each, and the car is sort of effectively can be on a narrower trajectory. So we're struggling a little bit in recent races, but it's all within our grasp to get it back. Fear not.
That's absolutely fascinating to hear that, but I wonder what is actually causing that problem. And we got a little clue from Christian Horner following the Italian Grand Prix. He suggested to the print media that the wind tunnel data isn't being replicated by what the car's actually doing out on track. And that's what we call a correlation issue, where the team's CFD, the virtual wind tunnel in the computer, the wind tunnel itself and the real-world race car are not all agreeing with each other about what the car should actually be doing. Well, one of the reasons for this, perhaps, is that Red Bull uses the oldest wind tunnel in Formula One. In fact, it's almost 75 years old and was originally built to develop aircraft for the Royal Air Force at the beginning of the Cold War. Huge upgrades have been done to that wind tunnel over the years, and they have replaced those beautiful wooden fan blades, but the tunnel is still quite old. It does obviously work, it's won a few world championships, hasn't it? But it isn't state-of-the-art anymore, and that's why Red Bull want to build a brand new wind tunnel. However, that process has been rather slowed down by the tortuous bureaucracy of the British planning system. And as I look at it, I'm not even sure even now that Red Bull have got the full planning consent to build that new facility, and it does take time to construct a wind tunnel, then calibrate it, and then start to use it. It's a long way from being ready, and possibly what might not even be ready for the 2026 car, maybe not even for the 2027 car. So that is going to hold Red Bull back a little bit. But to be honest, the wind tunnel does work, so calibrating that data shouldn't be too difficult, and it may just drift away from time to time, and every team has had those problems over the years. The other big factor that a lot of people have pointed to is this man, Adrian Newey. He decided to leave the Red Bull team at the Japanese Grand Prix in April and has recently announced that he'll be joining Aston Martin next year. And so as a result, Newey's departed Red Bull and gone off on a nice long 6-month holiday, mandated by Red Bull's contractual restrictions and also the FIA rules on aerodynamic personnel going from team to team, which means they cannot work for another team for 6 months. But Adrian Newey is just one man. There's a whole team of engineers at Red Bull. So despite the fact they've lost their head engineer, it doesn't really explain what's gone wrong with the development of the car. Is it Newey's fault? Probably not. It's just one of those things. Something that Red Bull are clearly struggling with, as are a lot of teams on the grid at the moment, is something that's hinted at by this clip back from the Miami Grand Prix in 2022. Take a look at the Mercedes and the way it's bouncing up and down. This characteristic porpoising sort of went away in terms of what we can see on track, where the cars are hopping up and down the straight. But it never really fully went away for any team on the grid. And as the cars have got faster, this characteristic, even in a slightly more subtle form, has come back to haunt a lot of the teams. The cars have got quicker, and at the end of the straights, the cars are being sucked down to the floor, and they start hopping up and down as the downforce loads increase, the floor seals, and then stalls, and then the car bounces back up. Red Bull have been struggling to get their new floor working, and that is part of the problem for Red Bull. But Ferrari, Mercedes, and a few other teams have also suffered from the same problem. McLaren being the exception, because they have a new floor that they've designed, but because of all the problems they've seen up and down the grid, they haven't actually put it on their car yet, because they're worried that they may suffer the same fate as Red Bull. So that's why it's interesting to see what Red Bull have introduced for the Azerbaijan Grand Prix this weekend. It's a new floor, and to me, it looks like a pretty interesting step, but Paul Monaghan wants to play down just how significant that introduction really is.
Well, it's not really a new floor. We have tried to reprofile little bits of it in the tunnels. It's amazingly subtle, yet the potential is, it could be quite significant, and we'll see how we go here really as the best judge of it.
Have you done that on both cars, or is one car got it?
We can split, we can make them common. Our test plan shall remain our test plan, shall we say, and if you ask nicely after P3, I might tell you.
Well, more fascinating stuff there from Paul Monaghan, but as I say, I do think he was playing it down a little bit. The new floor on the Red Bull, it's pretty hard to see the difference from the side of the floor edge. However, as he explained, all of the interesting stuff is up underneath where we're not allowed to look. But when he's starting talking about adjusting a little bit of curvature here, the height of a little bit of sculpting here or there, that's pretty fundamental changes to the floor, isn't it? And it does seem to have been working at least around the very dusty track conditions in Baku. However, in free practice 1, the cars were almost 5 seconds slower than they had been at the start of the season. Not just Red Bull, that goes for everybody in the field. And as we've already seen, the cars this year are quicker than last year. So when the cars get up to their full potential, we may see Red Bull start to struggle again. So that's something we just have to keep an eye on, not just this weekend, but also as we get to the very dirty and dusty Singapore circuit next week, another street circuit which could have slightly unpredictable results. We've seen it before for Red Bull there, haven't we? As we look on forward through the car, we've seen this rear wing that Red Bull have used at a couple of circuits so far where they've chopped down these 2 sculpts at the top. it's not, again, it's one of those parts that hasn't really worked out, and they're not using it on the car in Azerbaijan. I wonder if we'll actually see it again, perhaps in Mexico, where they're trying to get a bit of straight line speed, but that doesn't seem to be the normal case at Mexico in that thin air. So maybe that's had its day in Formula 1. We'll have to see it comes back next year. The big change that Red Bull kind of wanted to keep secret was the introduction of this new rear beam wing for Azerbaijan. Very sculpted, very different shape, and having something that's quite that different on the back of the car does hint at just how fundamental the changes to the floor of the car actually are. And Red Bull were pretty keen to keep that part of the car undercover, with their mechanics and team personnel standing right up at the back of the car during the mandatory show and tell session, trying to stop us seeing this little sculpted detail here. So it remains to be seen whether these upgrades will all work when the car gets up to full speed out on track, not just in Azerbaijan, but also going into the street circuit at Singapore. One thing is for sure though, Red Bull don't yet have a new Adrian Newey, and they don't have a new wind tunnel yet.